Welcome to another episode of Dialogues with me, Richard Reeves. I think it's no exaggeration to say that liberalism and liberal democracy are under pressure. And one of the most prominent liberal voices of our time is Frank Fukuyama, who's well known for his famous, and some would say infamous, book from '92, The End of History and the Last Man. And in this conversation, we talk a little bit about his journey, his intellectual journey, and how his thinking has evolved since then, including the central tension between the universalism of liberal morality, but the fact of nation states that put lines between people, as well as between the pluralism that liberal politics typically demands, but also the central importance of thymos, a Greek term. Turns out he's a classical Greek scholar, which I didn't know before this conversation, which is a term that gets at respect, dignity, and recognition. These are all issues that he picks up in his latest book, Liberalism and its Discontents. And in that book, he argues that the virtues of liberalism need to be clearly articulated and celebrated once again, and that they're no longer taken for granted. And so I think his own journey has been fascinating over the last 20 to 30 years. Along the way, we talk about the perils of the university tenure system. We actually start with that, the significance of the war in Ukraine and how that helps us to think about nationalism, good and bad, why Papua New Guinea is a good place to study political order, which was subject of two big books that he produced in the last few years, a relationship between liberalism as a political philosophy and laissez-faire capitalism. And spoiler there is that link is hugely overstated in his view and mine. And the content of a good life, or what it means in John Stuart Mill's words, to pursue our own good in our own way, or at least a good life as seen through the eyes of a liberal. So as you'll probably be able to tell, I really enjoyed catching up with his thinking. I think he's a really important thinker of our time, and I hope you enjoy it too. So Frank, welcome to Dialogues. Thanks very much for coming on.
Thanks very much, Richard, for having me.
I've enjoyed much of your work, actually. And although we're going to talk mostly today about your most recent book, Liberalism and its Discontents, I think we'll be drawing on some of your other work, including your previous work on identity, some of your work around political order, and way back to the end of history. But can we start with a bit of your own journey? I think you became sort of well known during that period of liberal triumph. Do you remember the good old days of liberalism between 1989 and 2009? But how did you get interested in these questions in the first place in your own intellectual journey?
Well, I had a number of very good teachers. That was one respect in which I was extremely fortunate. The first of the really formative ones was Alan Bloom, who was my first teacher at Cornell when I started as a freshman in the fall of 1970. He had just quit Cornell because of the Cornell crisis, but he taught a seminar on Plato's Republic. And that's what started me out as a classics major. I went on to learn Attic Greek so I could read Plato in the original. And I think, his major contribution was to really open my eyes to the importance of philosophy in this Socratic sense, where you're asking big questions and trying to reason your way towards an understanding of, what is the best way to live, what does the just city look like, questions of this sort. I took a lot of detours. I spent some time with French structuralism and deconstructionism and so forth. But wow. I ended up, retaining that kind of humanistic core to my education, which has come in extremely usefully in later stages of my career, even when I had moved on to more practical policy, kinds of issues.
So even as he was talking about the closing of the American mind, he was opening up your mind by the sounds of it, and to that sort of multidisciplinary nature. That explains, I think, a fair amount about your work, because it does range from classical history through philosophy, social science, and obviously political science too. And so it feels as if, and we'll get to some of the details in a moment, but just I'm interested in your method at the moment. When you're writing, it doesn't feel like you're attempting to write within a particular disciplinary lane. It's rather you're addressing a question and then drawing the evidence from whichever disciplines seem to work for you, which is relatively unusual still, I would say, in the academy.
Yes,
do you find
definitely. Yeah, well, I also have a theory about that and why I escaped it, which really has to do with academic tenure. You know, what an academic discipline does is it's a guardian of a methodology. And, you know, if you're a young academic trying to get tenure, you have to prove to your academic colleagues, and it's not all of them, it's a very, very small subset of them, that you've mastered the methodology. And in my experience, they care more about the methodology than the substance of whatever subject the methodology is investigating. And, you know, the result is that I think they're kind of mistrained by the time they actually do get tenure. They're now free to address broader, you know, questions, but they're very socialized into, you know, a particular way of looking at the world. And, you know, I've seen this in the past, you know, dealing, let's say, with a young, untenured economist. You ask them to work on an interdisciplinary project or a policy-oriented project, and because it's not going to produce an article in one of the top economics journals, they just don't want to do it, you know, because they're too scared that they're not going to get tenure. And as a result, you know, they end up just reinforcing these. Well, in fact, my colleague Mike McFall was saying that he actually liked working with undergraduates much better than graduate students because the undergraduates hadn't yet been socialized, you know, into these narrow disciplinary cubby holes. Now, the reason I escaped all this was I didn't start out as an academic. I started the first 10 years of my career were spent either at the State Department or at the RAND Corporation, the think tank in California. And I entered academia laterally when I started at George Mason, and I got my first academic job having tenure already. So I didn't have to prove to a bunch of disciplinary colleagues, you know, that I was a master of, you know, whatever political science consisted of at that time. And I feel, you know, I'm very grateful for that because it kind of freed me to really do whatever, you know, I wanted to do.
Well, it's interesting because you did have to sort of come in through the side window in a way to avoid that. And it's, I mean, this is not exactly what I plan to open with, but it is interesting to me how tenure in theory creates the platform for academic freedom. But by the time you get it, as you say, you've been trained in certain ways that actually mean you can't exercise that freedom very well by the time you've got it. I don't know if you know the work of the economist Raj Chetty. Out of Harvard, but his work very well known on economic opportunity. And he tells a great story of how he actually got access to the data from the IRS, upon which almost all of his work has been built. He has anonymized IRS data, which has allowed him to do this incredible work in social mobility. And what they did was they applied, so the IRS actually puts out bids for people to come and do research. And so once he'd got tenure, he bid to do a piece of work for the IRS on some really boring thing, business taxation. And then you had to say how much you would charge for the work. And he put zero, which meant they had to give him the job because he was easily the best value. But then he said, but once he was in, he said, while I'm here, do you mind if I do some other analysis? And a whole, honestly, he's changed the subject as a result of that. But he was very clear he could only do that once he had tenure. Everything was about get tenure. But he's probably the exception in a way that proves your rule, which is he was very strategic, which is I got to do a bunch of stuff to get tenure. But then once I got tenure, I'm just going to do the stuff that I think is going to have impact. A lot of which actually isn't that impressive, right? It's not that sophisticated econometrics. It's just very, very good descriptive work with big policy impact.
Right.
But most of them by then as I said, they've been socialized out of it.
Yeah, I had a professor who said that once you get tenure, you can hoist the Jolly Roger, and you know. But there's a surprisingly few number of academics that actually take advantage of that. It's kind of distressing. Yeah, I mean, I think these days with the politicization of everything, you know, some of the original motives for creating the tenure system have been coming back. So it really started at the University of Wisconsin, you know, back in the progressive era in the late 19th century when there were, you know, as now there were some state legislators that thought that there was a bunch of progressive professors that were really Marxists, and it was terrible that they were being paid with public money, and so they started going after them, and the tenure system was created to protect them. And unfortunately, you know, we're probably in an age where we're going to see, efforts to politicize and that. So I can see the reasons why tenure exists, but I do think that it has these unrecognized downsides, and the primary one is really not the effect on older professors that get lazy, but younger ones that get excessively rigid and narrow.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I didn't know some of that history, so I'm grateful for that, because it is an interesting system and quite an American one too. But let's talk about a bit about your own journey over the last, I guess, what is it? I don't know. This is like 30 years, I guess. I've done a review of your book, as we just mentioned before we pressed record, for literary review, and I think I described in that as you became the sort of poster boy for sort of liberal triumphalism during that period, and I think you have a very good set of arguments as to why your book, The End of History, was overinterpreted. I think it would be fair to say, but obviously it caught the tenor of the times, which was, it really was this sense of, riding high. Liberal democracy did seem to be kind of on the march across the world, especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. China and the WTO. Just like I felt like, sort of liberal democratic capitalism of one shape or another was likely to become the norm, hence your argument. Can you talk a little bit about your journey sort of since then? Because I found it very interesting to see it felt to me like you went back. You did those two very impressive volumes on political order and where it comes from, and then you've gone forward to identity and now what it means for liberalism. But obviously, in some people's eye, you were a little bit frozen in time as that guy, right? That guy, the one that said that everything was great. And he was wrong. So that's literally as sophisticated as some people's view of your work gets. I'm sorry to put it so bluntly, but you do hear that sometimes. So talk about your own journey.
I know that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and I constantly get the Twitter comments, oh, so history isn't over, is it? So I'm used to it. A lot of it was actually triggered by external events. So in the early 2000s, we had September 11th, and then the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq. And that actually triggered the eventual writing of that 2-volume series on political order because, first of all, it was just a really startling event that seemed to come out of left field. Nobody really understood who these jihadists were, what was motivating them. But then when we invaded these two countries, we toppled their governments, and we all of a sudden faced this basic problem that we had to create a state, but nobody in the American establishment had any idea how you create a state from scratch. And as I started thinking about political science, it wasn't as if I had read books in graduate school about how states originated. Everybody assumes that the state exists, and in fact, most political scientists see their job as constraining a pre-existing state. But if you have to build something from out of nothing, how did that happen? So I began looking around and realizing that, there's a pretty big literature in anthropology about, so-called pristine states and theories about how the first states arose, but political scientists don't pay any attention to that. So that's really what started this. And then I got involved in a lot of development projects. I worked for the World Bank, who sent me, after I had written about Iraq and Afghanistan, they sent me to Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste and the Solomons, which was a big problem for Australia because they were in the situation that America was in Iraq, where they had countries that really didn't have states or had extremely weak states, and they wanted to try to prop them up, and they wanted some advice on whether there are experiences in other parts of the world that could help them. That was one of the most fascinating times I've ever spent. I understand now why anthropologists love Papua New Guinea, because up in the highlands, it's probably one of the most authentic surviving tribal societies. It's 50 to 100 years behind anything in sub-Saharan Africa. And so if you want to see a completely differently organized society, and if you also want to see why is it that trying to overlay modern parliamentary institutions on top of this kind of society simply doesn't work, that was a great case of it. And so, wrestling with these kinds of issues and then doing a lot of work with failed states began to, it led me to this, which is really the bottom line conclusion of the political order books, that actually having a state matters. This really set me on the opposite side of former libertarian friends that, hate the state. But it really did seem to me historically, nobody develops if you don't have a state. And actually the process of getting from a patrimonial state to a modern state that is impersonal, uncorrupt, highly capable of delivering services, that's a really, really hard transition. And that's what led to the two volumes. The first volume looked at societies that were wrestling with this question of how do you get beyond kinship to having impersonal institutions. And that was also quite a fascinating journey, because I spent a lot of time looking at China, at the Ottomans, at the Arab world, at India, and seeing that there actually were these different strategies for making that transition. But then the other big insight that came in the second volume was going backwards, because many people in development and comparative politics sort of think of history as a one-way ratchet. And in fact, we used to have this idea of a consolidated democracy, that if you had 2 or 3 successive turnovers in elections, then you're a consolidated democracy, and the ratchet would never turn in the opposite direction. And I think, unfortunately, the United States in recent years has proved that's just not true, that anyone can go backwards.
Yes.
And, it's quite distressing to see the unraveling of democratic institutions, but, unfortunately, that's the reality. And so that consumed a lot of my time in the 2000s and the early 2010s, and then we got hit with the populist global revolution, and so that's really explains the last couple of books, because I was trying to think through that.
Which is what what I want to come to next. But it feels to me, looking at that sort of middle period of work, if you like, that you came to a greater appreciation, and I think many of us have now, of the institutions of liberalism and liberal democracy. I think a lot of us have spent time in the ideas of liberalism and kind of liberal democracy, and not enough time tackling the institutions, and obviously the formal institutions, but to some extent also the informal institutions, the norms, the culture, and so on. And so liberalism and liberal democracy, so say those two things separately, actually being a work in progress and a work that we're all engaged in, and that doesn't just happen in some instrumental way. So it's not like you've got a Congress, you've got a Supreme Court, you've got rule of law, you've got property, like job done. Actually, it's something that's created and is an ongoing creation, and it can be uncreated, right? You can, as you said, it can go backwards. And you actually say, I'm going to quote you here from the most recent book, liberalism is under severe threat, while it was once taken for granted. And I think that's a period what perhaps we were just referring to, when men, I will say myself included, really thought that sort of history was on our side as liberals. Its virtues need to be clearly articulated and celebrated once again. It's much more, so we're into an era of conditional liberalism and conditional democracy, rather than one that's assumed. Is that, and so that leads you then to your concerns about identity, and then kind of most recently it's
and I think it's healthy. I actually did have a chapter in the End of History and the Last Man called No Democracy Without Democrats, and it was basically an argument about human agency, that there is no historical mechanism that inevitably takes you to liberal democracy if people don't actually exercise agency and fight for it. And I think that, certainly Putin has reminded everybody of that fact, by his invasion of Ukraine, that there are these active threats. And I think, many people in Europe and North America got, way too complacent about the security of the existing liberal order. And, it's taken this kind of vivid threat to make people realize that, they do have to fight for things.
Yes,
So
and that there are liberal virtues, and there's a liberal ethos as well, and we'll maybe come on to thymos in a little bit, because I do think that's kind of super interesting as kind of like, what does it mean to be a liberal? So if like you can't have democracy without Democrats, and I think that was well put in your book and just now, but so you can't have liberalism without liberals. And in particular, you can't have liberal pluralism without kind of liberal pluralists. And so there's a set of virtues. And one of the things that's actually challenged me a bit, I don't know if you've engaged at all with the work of Joseph Henrich and his work on weird cultures, is that actually makes quite a compelling argument that it's actually our psychology has actually been affected by these institutions over time. And that actually, so it's not just a level of social norms and so on, but actually of our psychological makeup. And so that takes much longer to change. It can change. It's not hardwired, of course, but there's a certain Western psychology, to use the shorthand, that it tends to support those institutions and allows for impersonal trust. Does that in any way alter the way you think about it? I mean, you're strong in saying you can't just like parachute in democracy on top of a kin-based culture. But what about if we don't even think the same way?
So I'm perfectly willing to accept the idea, and a lot of this is coming out of a lot of cognitive neuroscience these days, that the brain is much more plastic than we've been assuming, and that it does get shaped, by early childhood experiences, by culture, by a lot of other factors. So it wouldn't be surprising at all if there are certain faculties that are more developed in certain societies, and that has actually a biological correlate. So I think that's entirely possible. The thing about Heinrich's book is that these weird people historically, may represent a particular cultural strand that developed at a particular moment. But I think that the thing that he doesn't get at is the question of universalism, whether there actually are certain ways of perceiving the world that, take on a more universal significance. And the big issue, I think, is the question of individualism, because individualism is absolutely crucial to liberal theory. This idea that we make decisions as individuals, that we have our rights protected as individuals, that the individual has greater authority than any group that the individual might be a member of. And what I said in both the political order books and also in the new book is that individualism historically was contingent. I mean, it didn't always exist, including in Western societies that were, kinship-oriented and much more group-oriented at certain historical periods. But, you can trace the growth of individualism both as a social phenomenon and as an ideology. In fact, this is the chapter I'm proudest of in The Origins of Political Order. Was I think that the title of that chapter was the Catholic Church Destroys the Family. Basically, it was this argument that a number of new family historians have made, that Heinrich makes also in his book. Yes,
he does make it too. Yeah.
That that basically the Catholic Church changing the rules of inheritance undermined these large kinship groups in the late Middle Ages, and therefore made possible the kind of individualism, in inheritance that then supported a broader kind of economic individualism, and then individualism as a social phenomenon. So I'm perfectly willing to concede that individualism is not universal, that most societies are not individualistic in the way that Western ones are, but I think that as you modernize, individualism becomes much more important. That's the source of, in a way, growth, entrepreneurship, risk-taking. A lot of things are made possible by individualism. And I think also as people get better educated and have more resources, their individual characteristics become more important to them. And so I do think that there's still an unanswered question about universalism, whether once you've tasted that kind of individualism, can you ever go back to a highly regimented, group-oriented society? And I think the jury is out on that, on that question.
Well, only if there was a huge amount of agreement amongst the groups. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be consistent with pluralism. I'll just note, actually, I think that one of the other aspects of this argument about the church and individualism is the impact on marriage. And so one of the things that Joe talks about a lot, and I actually had him on here too, is the way that cousin marriage was regulated.
That's right.
I mean, and that created kind of conditions of the nuclear family and impersonal trust too. But you've talked about universalism, and this is a real theme of your work, but I think perhaps particularly strongly of in your most recent book, which is, and I'll quote you here, you say, liberal democracies are premised on the equal recognition of the dignity of each of their citizens as individuals. So each and every, right, by implication. And so there is an inescapable universalist ethos and philosophy that lies at the heart of liberal democracies, right? Inescapably so, and I think you and I would agree positively so. That kind of equal dignity. But that raises all kinds of questions and problems. And one problem, so we'll start with one. So problem number one is, where's the line? And you're very clear about this. You kind of say, look, liberal as a philosophy really struggled to say why Americans matter more than Canadians or Mexicans, say, right? These nation-state lines feel very arbitrary, and it's why liberals have very often dreamt of universalism and global governments and etc., right? Which is because nation-states feel like a very arbitrary way to determine equal worth. And so there's this tension between the universalism at the heart of liberal democracy and the brute fact of nation-states. And I think the way you deal with that is just by accepting the brute fact as like, this is where we are right now. But I don't think you even attempt to, I don't think you can solve this at a kind of theoretical level. I think it's just a problem that we have to live with. Is that a fair summary of where you landed?
No, that's right. I mean, I tried to think through how you reconcile the division of the world into nations with the liberal premise. And it is a kind of pragmatic case that I make for it, which is that although the dignity of each individual under liberal theory is equal, that enforcement, so the dignity has to be protected by a liberal order that protects people's rights. And that enforcement power is something that's done by states that have limited territorial jurisdiction. And in fact, enforcement power is a scarce commodity. So there's no state in the world that can protect the rights of every person in the world, even though they deserve to have those rights protected. And in fact, you probably wouldn't want a state that tried to protect the rights of everybody in every other country outside of its own, borders. That would make for a lot of busybodiness.
That really would be a world policeman, taken literally, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So you wouldn't want that. And then, as a result, since enforcement power is a scarce resource and really needs to be exercised in a territorial manner, that means we're stuck with states. So that's the practical argument, but I think there's also a psychological dimension to this, which really has to do with the sphere of human empathy, that there are limits to it. Nobody except a very small handful of ultra-liberal types, is truly a citizen of the world in the sense that they, and this is kind of one of these moral question type things, would you take the suffering of somebody 8,000 miles on the other side of the world as seriously as the suffering of your own child? And I think that, there's a kind of moral insight that everybody has that says, yes, you do take more seriously the suffering of people that are close to you, that you're familiar with, that might be related to you, but that's okay, that a mother that spent more time worrying about babies, in Bangladesh than her own children, people would regard as, kind of morally strange, right?
It's like, this is very Peter Singer, of course, and it's kind of that ultra-utilitarian kind of view of the world. As somebody once said, who basically says that we should treat everyone the same. It's like Peter Singer is impossible to disagree with, but also impossible to follow. But I actually prefer, there's a great line from Bernard Williams, who's one of my favorite philosophers, who said that anybody, if you have two people that are drowning, right, and you can only pull one of them out of the water, and one of them is your wife, and the other one is, he used Archbishop Fenelon or something as some example, but just someone of great public value, let's say, right, Mother Teresa, or like, choose your. So you've got these two people, and it says, and if you think about which one to pull out of the water based on any kind of calculus, that's one thought too many. And of course he's exactly right. There's a kind of, just like anybody that's stopped to consider whether to pull their own wife or child or husband out of the water, but on some sort of rational, like, you'd think there's something profoundly morally wrong with that person.
No,
so it just doesn't get at this relationality, right? And that's where some of the thinner conceptions of individualism kind of leave us short. And I think we just have to be honest. We have to be honest about that, right?
That's right. So it means that we are going to be more altruistic and loyal to people that are close to us. And although human societies have spread, the circle of empathy much more broadly than tribal societies or hunter-gatherer societies, it's not unlimited. And the nation seems to be the unit, kind of the maximal unit of loyalty, where people feel a real deep emotional connection to other people. And I think, for example, that's one of the big failings of the EU, that I know of very few people that think of themselves as European first and then French or Italian or Dutch, second. It just doesn't work that way. So I think, for those emotional reasons, you need a kind of instinctive solidarity. It's exactly that, pulling your wife out of the water without having to think about it. That is really the glue of society, and you can't have people calculating rationally at every moment. Is my society better than some alternative, and I'm going to be loyal to it only if I calculate that that it is. You need that emotional attachment if the society is going to cohere. So that's another reason why I think we're not done with the nation at this point. Both the practical one of enforcement power, and then the one having to do with how we actually form loyalty and social solidarity.
Yeah, so that gets me to thymos or thymos, or however we're going to say it. So because you do
thymos. I said thymos.
And look, you're the classical Greek scholar, Frank. So I'm going to go with you. Thymos is probably, I'm sure, sounds right. But you do talk quite a bit about this in, I think this is more in Identity. So I'm well aware I'm bouncing between your books now, so I apologize. But in that place, I think you say, I'm quoting from there now, where you said, and you're looking back to actually the end of History and the Last Man, where you say, like, you noted that neither nationalism nor religion were about to disappear as forces in world politics. And one of the reasons they weren't about to disappear, and I'm quoting you again now, you say they had not fully solved the problem of thymos. Thymos is the part of the soul that craves recognition of dignity. And esothymia is the demand to be respected on an equal basis with other people. And then megalothymia is the desire to be recognized as superior. So this idea really is very strong in your work now of equal dignity and of equal respect. And at one point you even said we need a better theory of the human soul, and that we, a liberal democracy, can only get us so far in terms of recognize is what I read you as saying, right? And the other forces, and I think right now, for example, Ukrainian nationalism is probably seen as a good thing by most people, whereas Russian nationalism maybe isn't. And I'm just interested to hear you talk a little bit more about the relationship between, if you like, the individualism and universalism of liberalism, or liberal democracy, to use a broader term, and the sort of thymos value of nationalism and religion, tribes, areas, etc., and how you now think about the likely balance of those, and whether you think that it's just a matter of waiting it out. I used to think myself, we'll wait it out, and eventually we won't need those other things. But I absolutely don't believe that anymore, and that it's really about a balance between the two. How do you think about that now?
Well, so isothymia, this desire to be treated as equal, is really one of the things that drives people towards democracy. I like the example of Mohammed Bouazizi that sparked the Arab Spring, the vegetable seller in Tunisia who had his cart confiscated, and he wasn't treated as a human being by the police. They wouldn't answer his questions, they wouldn't talk to him, and he got very upset with that and set himself on fire. And that experience was so common for people living under these Arab dictatorships that they all got out in the streets to in sympathy with him. And that's a case where you're not recognizing my equal dignity as a human being. You're not treating me as a human being. You're just treating me as an object. And so that's very powerful as a spur against authoritarian government, because an authoritarian government, the most gentle kinds like Singapore treat you as a child, where you don't know your own self-interest, so the state is going to paternalistically take care of you. The worst ones treat you as trash, you can be liquidated or eliminated and so forth. So there is this, desire to be equally recognized, but once you achieve a society of equal recognition, it becomes a little bit thin, because, you're kind of equal to every other person in the society. You certainly don't like it if you're not treated equally, but for a lot of people, I think that's not enough, both on an individual level and on a group level. And so people want to, be part of something larger. And I think the appeal of nationalism is that it doesn't treat people as part of a kind of universal humanity who is equal to every other person in the world. It treats you as a member of a group that has a certain culture, a certain history. They worship certain gods, they have a certain way of life, and that special recognition for the group is really the underlying motive for nationalism. And just as an individual can get very angry if he or she is disrespected, a group can get extremely angry if it is disrespected. And so, and again, it plays out in different ways. I mean, if you're a marginalized racial minority, you may be just fighting for isothymia, for equal recognition. But a lot of times people want something more than that, so they want to be recognized as superior. And I think that's kind of what's the problem with Russian national identity right now, is that that identity can't be divorced from the desire to dominate other people around you, and that is a thicker form of identity and recognition than the liberal kind, and it sort of explains why liberalism is not enough for people oftentimes.
Yeah, so it's defining against, I think, rather than a defining by, right? Mm-hmm. We see more of that, I think, in some of the polarization we see now. It's like, I am like this because I'm not you, right? And so it's that, I mean, I haven't really thought this through, but it does seem like there are, I mean, you talk a bit about this, different identities, which is something like I'm X, Y, and Z, you're A, B, and C. But we can look each other in the eye and treat each other with respect, because feel pretty solid in my identity as X, Y, Z, not to be threatened by your identity as, A, B, C. Whereas there's another view, which is like your very presence, your difference is threatening to me. And so what we need is kind of more homogeny. There's a nice line in, Leon Wieseltier has a piece on Christianism in which is super interesting. There's this lovely line about an argument he had with, which conservative was it, where he just said to him, look, I don't think it's because I'm in the synagogue down the street that you're struggling to keep your kids in your Catholic church. That was the line. But there is a tendency now to say, because, I don't know, we're more racially diverse, that's threatening my white identity. Because we're more religiously diverse, it's threatening my Christian identity, or ad infinitum in a way, because I have to sort of separate myself so some of these identities turn out to be quite fragile in some ways, in the way that they're held. And what nationalism at its best, patriotism is probably is a way to have a bigger group that embraces the smaller, right, the groupiness within the group. And so I wonder whether you worry at all now about how the very idea of being proud to be American is a problem, right? Because that feels like it's getting quite political. In fact, we're driving through the South the other day, and my wife said to me, she said, I'm really worried now that actually if you fly a flag outside your house, people just assume you're a Republican. They assume you're right wing, right? And that that's not a Confederate flag, it's not a Trump flag, it's the American flag, which as a new American I'm very proud of. But she worries about now because she thinks that even that, and I do think this the discussion about history and so on. So how do you feel about the discussion of being American is playing into this debate about identity now?
Well, I think in a kind of unhelpful way, there's been this long evolution of American national identity. And, before the Civil War, it was very limited. It was only white men with property that were full citizens and had a full set of rights. And really, American history since that time has been this gradual expansion of the circle of people who are recognized as being deserving of full citizenship. So, after the Civil War, African Americans in theory were, brought into that circle, although they were very quickly excluded through other means other than slavery. With Jim Crow, women were brought in 1919 or 20.
1928 on equal terms, I think.
Okay. Right? Yeah. And then obviously, that struggle is continuing, gays and lesbians, various other marginalized groups. And I think that the important achievement in national identity was one that was reached after the civil rights movement, when there was a clear, I think, sense that, American identity would no longer be defined in ethnic, racial, or religious terms. That rather it would be a kind of civic national identity that was built around allegiance to the Constitution, to a certain set of founding democratic and liberal principles, and that's really what made you an American, and not your skin color or your ancestry or your gender or anything else. And I think that was a real achievement. I mean, it's certainly the way that I thought of myself, not being a white American, but to me growing up, it didn't matter because that was never part of the definition of being an American. And I think that one of the great, tragedies right now of the present moment is that there are people that want to walk that back, that do want to return to a kind of racial understanding of who an American is. And then, there's actually a left-wing threat to that identity as well, because people on the left would like to actually kind of de-emphasize the privilege of being an American in a lot of ways. So
yes. And lean more into some of the smaller group identities. And obviously there are extreme examples that make for good press of affinity groups in elementary schools and so on. But I agree with that. And in fact, one of my most modest but perhaps most radical policy proposals ever was every high school student should attend a naturalization ceremony.
Yeah, that would be a good idea.
Graduating, because having been at one myself, where
it's very moving.
It isn't it? Have you been to one?
Yeah.
They really are. And for me, it was like I had a green card, so it wasn't that big a deal practically, and I wanted to vote. I actually I was in the last group of people to become a citizen on that day in Maryland and still be eligible to register to vote in 2016. And it was, I went along, I get it done, then I can register to vote. And it was, I was blown away. I mean, the Afghan family next to me, the Mexican-American family behind me, the Iranian family, the tears, it was incredibly, and then every single one of us went and registered to vote. And for some of those people, that was, the sense of pride and joy, it's just incredible, isn't it? And I think a lot of cradle Americans, if I can call them that, don't realize what a huge deal it is.
No, absolutely. Yeah.
How precious it can be.
Yeah. So, Marty Lipset, one of the other great teachers that I had, used to say this about American identity, that, let's say, I don't want to pick on the Germans, but if you're a Turk who grew up in Germany, your parents, were German citizens, you still can't get up and say, I'm a German, because that adjective still has a racial or ethnic connotation. And that's true in a lot of countries, like in Japan, national identity really is very much racially based. And in fact, even a Korean that may be physically indistinguishable from someone that's Japanese, doesn't qualify. So it's a really big achievement in the United States at a naturalizations ceremony when somebody with a brown skin from Guatemala or somebody from your Korean grocer can get up and say, I'm an American, and nobody will laugh at them.
Mm-hmm.
I've always thought that was a really great achievement of this country, and one of the things that makes me proud to be an American is that we've detached Americanness from race or religion, and I think that's very important, and I think the people that want to reattach it to one of those characteristics are really dragging us backwards.
Yeah, and that's true on both sides, as you say, and so
Mm-hmm.
I agree. There's something rather beautiful about the fact of having that citizenship, which is not captured by the sort of technocratic language around it a little bit. I want to talk a bit about economic inequality, because I see that as a rising theme in your work, and in your most recent book, Liberalism and its Discontents, you say liberalism constituted the ideological basis for a market economy, and hence in the minds of many is implicated in the inequalities entailed by capitalism. So one of the reasons for the discontent at liberalism is precisely because it's associated with a certain kind of economic, fairly or unfairly, and maybe you can comment on that too. And I think there's a big debate there, but it's seen as the underpinning philosophical justification, as you say, for market economies. And look what's happened to inequality in market economies recently, which is a field that I've done quite a bit of work in, and I think does fuel a lot of this discontent. And so, is it true that that's become a bigger theme of your work, and B, why is that, and C, where does that lead you to in terms of rethinking some of your earlier positions, maybe even in terms of policy?
Well, that I think is simply reacting to events because inequality has been growing steadily over the last, 40, 50 years, and it particularly accelerated when we entered into this kind of hyper-globalization in the 1990s and 2000s. And it also resulted in things like the 2008 financial crisis, because you had this neoliberal set of... I distinguish between kind of classical economic liberalism and what's been labeled neoliberalism.
Okay, that's important. So let's spend a moment...
It's really the Chicago school.
Talk us through the difference.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Chicago school. It's Milton Friedman and economists like him who, really think that the market is the solution to many, social problems. The state is, regarded very negatively as an obstacle to growth and to basic fairness. And I think under the sway of those ideas, economic policy did not respond to actual empirical conditions. It became a kind of ideology that, the state was always bad and needed to be taken out of the equation, where you could, and, decentralized market-based solutions were necessarily better. And I think that directly led to the financial crisis, because, there had been a whole series of efforts to deregulate the financial markets, beginning in the late 80s, but then continuing. It culminated in this Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act that was passed by Congress and signed by Bill Clinton in the late 1990s, that basically took away a lot of the protections that had existed under Glass-Steagall and the regime that came out of the Depression. And I think that allowed these big banks to take, huge risks with other people's money, and that was the ultimate cause of the crash in 2008. So the reason that I'm more in favor of left-wing economic policies is that I think the right-wing ones have failed. I mean, they've led to a higher level of inequality that makes democracy harder to sustain, and I think that they've also destabilized the system in ways that are also very destructive to the legitimacy of democracy.
Yeah. So there's two things there, though, aren't there? There's the fact of economic inequality, which you said, as I'm glad you said, that accelerated in the late 80s and 90s, and has actually been growing much more slowly since then, if at all. But also the financialization of the economy. So they're related, but different things. It's similar in the UK. I mean, I vividly remember being at the press. I was a journalist at the time, being at the press conference where Gordon Brown announced the new light touch regulation regime for the City of London. It really took a new Labour government to go further even than the Conservative governments had gone to deregulate many of the financial markets that many years later we saw kind of leading us to that crisis. But you do this neoliberalism, classical liberalism distinction. And I do think it's quite important to separate capitalism from liberal democracy. It's not, I mean, I think you can argue for capitalism on its own merits, but I think for a lot of people it was liberal democratic capitalism. And I'm thinking Branko Milanović's book saying, actually, it's called, I don't know, One World or something, but he basically argues that like capitalism's everywhere now, and it turns out that you can do capitalism without liberal democracy. State capitalism is doing quite well in China, for example. And so this idea that it was a package deal is A, questionable just empirically, but B, I think it's just wrong morally. I mean, if you go back to Smith and Mill and many of these other liberals, they weren't neoliberals. They were agnostic about the state, and they were very concerned about inequality. What they were ultimately concerned about was liberty and equality. And their test of any institutional set of arrangements was how far it furthered those ends. And at some point along the line, capitalism got somehow merged intellectually with liberalism. And so someone said to me the other day, for the project I'm doing, we need a better name for a post-neoliberal economy. And I said, well, how about a liberal economy? Right, maybe post neoliberal means because the neo is right, because it's not. I mean, it's not true that liberal economics leads you to laissez-faire, is it? Just historically,
no, it shouldn't. Well, I do think that among the rights and the forms of autonomy that a liberal society protects, property rights and the liberty to transact. Are components of it and have been from the beginning. And you can justify that both as a philosophical matter and as a kind of practical matter. As a philosophical matter, if you say that people have the right to make decisions on their own, one of the most important ones they make is, how am I going to earn my living and who am I going to transact with? Can I accumulate property? This sort of thing. Certainly with John Locke, that was really, central to his thought. So I don't think they're entirely divorced, but, when you talk about the policy decisions that we've been confronted with, like how big a state should we have, how much regulation, how much public sector ownership, all of these things I don't think are determined by liberal ideology. I think that, if you have a system that fundamentally protects the rights of citizens, individual citizens, then you're in a liberal regime, even if you do a relatively large amount of redistribution and have a really big social safety net. So I think that, Sweden and Denmark are liberal regimes. Even though, the Danes used to have like a 60% marginal tax rate, but it's still a liberal regime. I'm glad you raised the Nordics, actually, because what's interesting about them in this context, I think, is that they actually have relatively lightly regulated product markets, particularly, and consumer markets. And they do have labour market regulations, but they lean very, very hard on the welfare side of it. I sometimes think one of the problems in the US is that because we have such a threadbare welfare system, we end up trying to do a lot of our social policy through the labour market. It's sort of playing catch up in a way, but there's a pretty good argument, I think, that something like a strong welfare state and a pretty free labour and product market isn't a bad combination. I mean, there's nothing, but I think your point holds, is there's nothing magic about any particular formula. There's lots of different ways, lots of different ways that you can go about it, I think. Yeah, and I don't think the liberal theory dictates a particular approach.
No, to some extent, it's an adjunct to it rather than central to it. But I do think that's one of the problems, and I think you're quite right to identify that is in people's minds. It was liberalism is what did inequality to us, right? Whereas in fact, it was much more supply side conservatism, very often then absorbed by the new left of people like Blair and Clinton and so on, who I will say, hands up, I was a big supporter of. I think it's really important. I did not see some of this coming. One of the areas I worried a little bit about is in whether you give a little bit too much ground in places to, let's say, to the communitarian line of thinking. So the communitarian view that the problem with liberalism is it's all atomized individuals and where we shouldn't judge anybody else. It's like, whatever works for you, very separate and so on. Whereas in fact we're relational and we have to have common. So Michael Sandel type criticisms, right? Or even some common good, so on. And I thought you gave a bit too much ground to them. And there was one point in particular where you contrasted these. It was a very communitarian move, actually. You contrasted two individuals, and it was deliberately caricatured. A kind of a high guy didn't finish high school, smoked weed, no interest in doing it, just not doing anything useful with his life, basically. And you contrast him with this single mom who's working and studying and doing the best and volunteering and so on. So this kind of, you took this very strong contrast, and then you said, and I quote you here, you say, John, you talk about rules particularly, but I think this would apply more to liberalism more generally, but you can tell me if that's wrong. Would not allow either public authorities or the rest of us to pass judgment on these two individuals. And it was the addition of those 5 words, or the rest of us, where I think I depart from you. Because even though in a liberal state, the public authorities are not going to pass judgment on the weed smoking dropout, because in the end, it's his decision whether to be, how he's constructing his version of the good life, right? But it doesn't stop me judging him. So I don't think there's anything in liberal theory generally, or even in Rawlsian theory, that stops me from judging him. And in fact, I think this is one of the problems with liberals, actually, is that they shy away from judgment. Whereas I think that moral judgment, social norms, strong culture is more important to liberals than it is to either libertarians or conservatives.
Yeah,
because otherwise you have you have anarchy on one hand, or you mentioned earlier paternalism, which is like, I think actually liberalism requires more of that kind of moralizing than you suggested.
No, I think it does as a practical matter. I think what I was trying to get at is this Rawlsian idea that justice always trumps the good, that liberalism is not trying to protect any particular substantive view of the good life. And, I think that that's a wrong understanding of why we want to live in a liberal society. I think we actually want to live in a liberal society because we do want to be able to pursue, particular visions of the good life, but we want to do it peacefully and in ways that don't, obstruct other people's ability to do the same. And so it's kind of the distinction between an anti-clerical regime and a regime that protects religious liberty. So the American First Amendment, protects the free exercise of religion. It doesn't guard us from religion. But there are interpretations, of a secular society that say, no, actually the state needs to protect, individuals from religion and, including the social, conformity that religious belief prescribes. So I do think that there is a little bit of that in, in Rawlsian liberal thought that really prizes non-judgmentalism because it wants to shy away from, substantive understandings of morality.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that's right. And I guess what I'm saying, I think the rest of us, I think as individuals, we have absolute power to pass judgment on those two individuals, and we would if they were in our own lives, for sure, right? If I have 3 sons, for example, if one of them is, person A in your scenario and the other one is person B, you can bet person A is going to be hearing some harsh words from me, or even a friend or so on too. And I see that as important. I guess, I think there's a middle ground between us, because I'm thinking about Mill's quote, which is, the only freedom worthy of the name is pursuing our own good in our own way. And I'm only thinking about this particularly closely now, which is that this idea of pursuing actually may be the most important word in that sentence, although it's not the one I've really reflected on before. There's something about agency, to come back to almost where you started, Frank, this idea of the agentic self that's missing in your first person, the sort of person that's just not doing anything with their lives. And so maybe what you're really suggesting is that liberalism is perfectly willing to sort of pass judgment in theory, or should be willing to pass judgment in theory, of someone who's not doing anything with their lives. Precisely what they do with it, so long as it's not harmful, might be a different question. But it seems to me what bothers you about the guy smoking weed not doing anything is he's not showing agency. And in the end, liberalism is about agency. It's not just about leaving you alone. It's about having a view of the good where you are pursuing it, to use kind of Mill's verb again.
Yeah, well, maybe. I think that, you cannot be... you cannot rest everything simply on the active pursuit of something, because the substantive content of what you are pursuing also matters, and I guess what I was thinking of was that any liberal society needs people to actively exercise not just some virtues, but they need to exercise liberal virtues, right, of tolerance, of deliberation, of, rational discourse, and loyalty, to the liberal institutions themselves. And so it goes beyond simply exercising agency, because you can exercise agency to do a lot of, well, at best, worthless things, but, at the other end of the scale, actively socially destructive things.
Well,
there are many socially destructive things that we do that are not illegal, and you also want to have a substantive view of what people ought to be doing. This came out. I think I may have stuck this simply in a footnote, but there's this discussion in Kant about whether we have a duty to educate ourselves, and Kant actually at one point, says, no, actually, we don't have this duty. We simply have the categorical imperative. And it was Bill Galston in one of his books pointed out that Kant on this point was actually quite inconsistent, because you can find other parts of his writing in which he praises, people that educate themselves. And that was not something where a liberal could be indifferent, as to what, so that self-education was a substantive vision of the good, and in a liberal society, you had to show preference for that. And so I guess that's kind of what I was getting at, is that you can't be neutral with regard to you can't be completely neutral with regard to substantive aims. For Rawls, the only place where that becomes verboten is where you're interfering with somebody else's pursuit of substantive aims. And I guess what I would argue is that there has to be a kind of broader, scope for that kind of judgment.
Yes, I guess I'm probably doing too much Mill right now, but I think because it's so central. I think Mill said we're all under a moral responsibility to develop our character, and so there is something, this sort of sense of because we're individuals, and actually it's like, I wonder sometimes whether liberalism does actually create the conditions for its own perpetuation in that sense. And maybe this, I've done a bit of work on respect, and whilst I don't think tolerance is enough anymore for each other, I think we have to respect each other, but also probably self-respect. And self-respect requires you to make something of what you've been given. It actually requires you to kind of use the unique talents, which might lead you in a religious direction, which is probably a conversation for another day. But I do think kind of what's the basis for that kind of sense of us being unique, and you talk a little bit about that. And I think you treat religion respectfully, to use that word again, as a potential source for that sense of self. which is
Definitely.
I'll let you go, Frank, but just one sentence on what makes you hopeful. No, and one sentence on what you're most worried about as you kind of survey the landscape. Now, let's do what most worried about first. A, because that tends to be easier right now, and B, because then we can leave on a high note. But something that what are you most worried about, and what are you most hopeful about?
Well, I've been doing a lot of work with Ukrainians over the last 8 years, and obviously I worry very much about them personally, and I worry about what's going to happen to world politics if Putin manages to, succeed in even a part of his agenda of grabbing as much of that country as he can. And it plays into our politics here because our populists like Putin. And a successful Putin sets a certain model for all the Le Pens and Trumps and, Viktor Orbáns and so forth around the world. So you're right. That's an easy one to.
Yeah,
that's an easy
bad
one
news
to
one's
answer
easy right now. Yeah.
I guess in terms of what gives me hope. I guess, what I've always thought is that if you look at history in a kind of long enough perspective, you see that there are these broader patterns. And, the first half of the 20th century was pretty horrendous in terms of political outcomes, but it nonetheless laid the ground for the next 75 years that were actually pretty good. And so it could be that, in a way, the current crises are simply laying the basis for a longer term, restoration of liberal values. So I don't know if that's a reason for hope, but
Well, it's the dark is before the dawn, and I do think, as you say in your most recent book, more generally, and something that's I think liberals need to hear is this. It doesn't do it by itself.
Mm-hmm.
And I've written a little bit about this myself. I think that you've used the word complacent, and I do think that we were complacent and that we're so used to some of these outcomes and institutions that we didn't realize we had to fight. Liberals for a long time had to fight pretty hard against a lot of vested interests, and I think sort of lost that fighting spirit. But if nothing else, we kind of learned to do that. And I see some signs of that popping up, which is a sort of awakening in a way of a liberal conscience. After a sort of few years of complacency. So, well, with that, I will let you go. Your latest book is Liberalism and its Discontents, but I would also encourage anyone listening to this to look back through your back catalogue, and in particular at the 2-volume work you did on political order. I thought The Origins of Political Order was genuinely a really terrific book, and I admire your ability to do that kind of really in-depth and sustained work, as well as the more public intellectual side of your work too. And I think that some people know one side of your work and some people know the other side of it, but it's really, I think it's really worth people. These are much longer books, I will say.
Yes.
Your books either seem to be really succinct or not. There's no middle ground with you, Frank. But those are generally a two-volume must-read, I think, for anyone who's interested in this stuff, as well as your most recent work. So thank you for your work, and thank you for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to Dialogues. I hope you enjoyed that conversation. And if you did, please take a moment to follow, like, rate, and share the podcast in all the usual places. And send me your thoughts and ideas, including for future guests, to dialoguespod@gmail.com. That's dialoguespod@gmail.com. I'll see you next time.